From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is The Week's Worst with Allen and Vadum.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capital Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President of Capital Research Center and Editor-in-Chief of BombThrowers.com.
And I'm Scott Walter, President of the Capital Research Center, and I'll moderate this podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. This past Friday, March 24, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan withdrew his bill, the American Health Care Act of 2017, which was intended to repeal and replace Obamacare, after he couldn't get sufficient support to pass it. The bill was attacked by moderate Republicans for supposedly causing too much loss of insurance coverage and raising costs, but it was ultimately killed because of the conservative House Freedom Caucus, which refused to vote for it. They were working with Senator Rand Paul, who dubbed the bill Obamacare Light. Matthew, could you tell us broadly what your thoughts are on this bill's being pulled?
I personally am delighted, Scott, so I'm so glad you asked me that. This was a terrible bill. It was a train wreck from the beginning. It demonstrated that the powers that be in Washington, the establishment, including the establishment within the Republican Party, which does exist no matter what George Will has to say about it, never wanted to rip Obamacare out by its roots. They wanted to keep it there in place. And so the bill, the Ryancare bill, Rhinocare, whatever you'd like to call it, Trump care, did not shake the foundation of Obamacare. It left it there in place while changing a few things around the margins, I guess ostensibly to make it more palatable, to make it last longer. Establishment Republicans, or rhinos, wanted to keep it in place because they wanted a villain to run against in perpetuity. And it's been very successful as a villain, as a whipping boy for the past 7 years, helping Republicans win unprecedented electoral victories in Congress and reducing the Democratic Party to its lowest point since 1920, at least, depending on how you slice up the figures. So they wanted to keep the swamp here, wanted to keep it swampy, and for the time being it's going to remain swampy, and I can only hope that those who truly want to get rid of Obamacare, repeal, get around to doing it. And I can only hope that President Trump takes his lumps and learns from his mistakes, though I'm not entirely certain that that is happening right now.
Well, speaking of the president, Steve, President Trump supported this legislation as well, and not just in a little way, but in a very big way. And a lot of people would say that, look, it sounds like, this is what he was talking about on the campaign trail when he said, look, the government probably have to pay for a lot of health care. Wasn't this just Trump following through on his promises?
Well, the problem is you have a system, Obamacare, which was designed to collapse. Remember, you have to think back to how this thing got passed. Remember that it had passed the Senate without a single vote to spare. And then the Democrats lost a Senate seat, which was the Scott Brown election in Massachusetts for the seat that had been held by Teddy Kennedy. So there was a problem, which is they no longer had the votes to pass this thing. And they responded by taking this half-finished bunch of gobbledygook. It was, I once characterized it as a bunch of lobbyists writing down what they wanted on little index cards and throwing it in a big fishbowl. I'm not saying that happened literally, but that's essentially how this thing was put together. And then they would fix it later because they could pass it through the House, and then it would go back to the Senate. And at that point, they could get together in conference and they could work out all these inconsistencies and aspects of Obamacare that made literally no sense. Nobody in the right mind would have thought this thing would work. And but they were stuck because now they couldn't put it back through the Senate. They had to pass it as is, as it was at that point. So it's just a mess. It's not even this 2,700 page bill that Nancy Pelosi famously said they'd have to pass it to find out what was in it. Was never intended to be actual legislation. And so then they tried to fix it by having the Obama administration simply fix not enforce parts of it and add parts that weren't in there originally. And while they were saying that Obamacare was the law of the land, they were making it up as they went along. So now you have Donald Trump. He runs for president, and he promises to get us out of that mess. And he talks about repealing and replacing. The replacing part comes that in that there are some people, a small number of people, who actually do benefit from some program like this, that is, people with pre-existing conditions. I say that as someone who has a pre-existing condition. I had so-called terminal cancer many years ago, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that affects my ability to get insurance. So I appreciate that. I have many friends and associates who are in situations where they need help. But really, when you think about it, it's a small percentage of the population. It's only about 3% of the population that has a hard time getting insurance because of pre-existing condition. Remember that poor people are already covered by Medicaid, and older people are already covered by Medicare. So out of the remaining group, it's about 3% of the population. And you could have a program that dealt with them. So if you had something that got rid of Obamacare and then took care of the 3%, that would solve the problems for most people in this country. But that's too simple. And this is a bill written by the insurance companies to benefit the insurance companies. The bailout from taxpayers is projected to be $12,000 per family over a course of 10 years to insurance companies. And they are not going to let you have a simple repeal and replace. And that's the problem the president was stuck with.
Well, Matthew, the bill did certainly keep aspects of Obamacare that are really popular, like mandating the coverage for pre-existing conditions, which Steve just mentioned, and allowing young people to stay on their parents' health care till through age 26. Why do you think it was a good idea to fight those things? I mean, do you want to leave those with pre-existing conditions on the street to die?
Yes, I do, actually. No, not seriously. In my role as a supervillain on the internet, I had to say that. These are bad provisions that, especially, it's harder for me to make the argument about the kids staying on their parents' policies until they're 26. But the pre-existing conditions ban, which is actually a ban on insurers refusing coverage on the basis of pre-existing conditions, that converts insurance into something other than insurance. It makes it into like a PPO, like a preferred provider organization, a prepackaged set of services that you can draw upon, and it's not insurance. It's never, if you allow, if you use the old standby analogy, if you allow a fire insurance policy to be underwritten on a house that is already on fire, you're going to find that the insurer is insolvent pretty quickly. And that's why they have to allow insurance companies to refuse to cover certain people. And then if the government wants to find a way around that, then they can, as Steve was saying a moment ago, create a program to deal with people, high-risk pools or what have you. But it's not insurance if you if you forbid insurers from declining coverage for pre-existing conditions. It just doesn't make any sense. It gives everybody a limitless incentive to feed at the trough, to draw out services from the insurance companies, to draw out payments without any countervailing incentive to keep costs down or to be financially responsible.
And let me say this: whole point of this.
And Steve can correct everything I just said was wrong.
No. And let's make it clear. When I talk about a program for the 3% that have pre-existing conditions, I'm talking about something that's on budget. So you know how much it costs, and it's there for everybody to see and debate about and so forth. When you stick it into the insurance system, the problem is you lose track. There is no way to know how much of my insurance is because I'm subsidizing someone with maybe a pre-existing condition that's worse than mine. Or maybe, I mean, the cross subsidies in this include taking from young people and giving to old people. And so the young people are, if they buy insurance, they're paying like 6 times what they would pay if there were a free market for insurance, because young people don't need to spend as much on healthcare as older people, men to women, taking from people who don't want abortions and giving that to people who do want abortions, taking money from people in the suburbs and giving it to people in the cities. And so what you end up with is essentially everybody, each person with his hand in somebody else's pocket, and then that person has his hand and her hand in somebody else's pocket, and so on. And it's just a giant. Imagine everybody in the country, each person with their 2 hands in other people's pockets. It's insane, and you can't. It's not an insurance business. It's insurance as a regulated utility. And remember that when it came to electrical power, when it came to the phone company and other regulated utilities, that regulated utility model, where a politically connected corporation gets to have guaranteed profits and gets all their competition shut out. That's the model that probably kept the phone company, the phone services and power services technologically. It might have maybe 50 years behind, and that's what we're headed into with medical care. We're creating the insurance companies as a regulated utility, and then we're surprised that they spend so much money trying to bribe politicians to get exactly what they want in there, and that is the real mess that we see with Obamacare.
Really, the best system would just be to sweep away almost all of the current healthcare regulations and just have fee for service. Good old fashioned. You go to the doctor, you pay a fee. That would drive prices down. But in the meantime, the thing that they could do, the single change that I think that would have the most positive effect would be to allow competition across state lines, because then you could buy your insurance from whatever state, from a company in whatever state offered you the best deal. It would also put natural market pressure on the states to drop all these mandates. Like, why on earth should an elderly man or any man have to subsidize a single woman's maternity coverage? That just doesn't make any sense.
Or why should a 60-year-old woman who works behind the counter at McDonald's subsidize a 25-year-old woman who's going to be a millionaire?
Right. And how about a 30-year-old hermaphrodite? Why should that person get mandated coverage from some states? And we chuckle, but it really does exist. Sex reassignment surgery is mandated in some states. It has to be covered under the insurance policies. Why should anybody have to pay for that other than the person who wants it?
But the answer, which is that if you ban the sale of...
The answer is you're racist.
The answer is if you ban the sale of health insurance across state lines, it's a great scam, because then in a given state, the chiropractors all get together and they give money to the politicians, and the politicians in that state decide to mandate chiropractic as part of the coverage. Some other place it might be, hair transplants. It might be holistic care. Remember that Obamacare, I love how the Obama people talk about how they're for science, but there's aromatherapy, there's holistic medicine, there's acupuncture covered under Obamacare. There are all sorts of things that you have in certain areas that are mandated in certain areas and not in others. And if you had a nationwide market, then there would be a race to provide the most affordable care. Gee, affordable, wouldn't that be nice? The most affordable care rather than the care that had the most mandates. And so the politicians, particularly at the state level, they love the idea that you can't sell health insurance across state lines because it allows them to collect basically bribes for having mandates or not having mandates.
We really need to push the insurance companies out of healthcare altogether. That would be nice.
Well, they're a big part of the problem here. Remember that the insurance companies, people think of them as some sort of free market thing. The insurance companies during the Obamacare debate were the top spokesman was a woman named Karen Ignani. And this was America's Health Insurance Plans, or AHIP. And remember that the health insurers had been against Ryancare. I was involved in that fight, and that's one of the reasons we won, is that they had like the commercial with the two, the couple sitting there at the table talking about how they'd be hurt by this plan. And they they switched sides. On Obamacare. Surprise, surprise. Because whereas the Hillary plan had been based largely on an HMO model, the big difference was that Obamacare was based on benefiting the insurance companies. And the woman who was in charge of this was Karen Ignani. Now, who is she? She started her career working for Walter Reuther's Committee of 100 for National Health Insurance. She was the director, I believe, of health policy for the AFL-CIO, which supported socialized medicine, as people on my side would call it. And I remember there was one scene where there was some congressional hearing, and one of the people who was promoting Obamacare walked up to Karen Ignani, and some reporter was like breathless. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen when the head of the insurance companies meets the person who's promoting Obamacare? Well, what happened was they hugged each other, and they did because they were on the same side.
How touching!
And now we're talking again about this. One of the things that would be most beneficial would be to make sure, and this has been suggested by Ted Cruz and others, Marco Rubio particularly, that we just make sure the insurance companies don't get to rip the rest of us off in this process, and then see what they think about it.
Well, now, Matthew, of course, a lot of people say that even if the bill was flawed that was pulled this past week, it was still better than Obamacare as it was handed down to us from the last president. So aren't you just letting the perfect be the enemy of the good?
Okay, I'll treat that as a serious question, just for sake of argument. No, it's in some ways it's even worse. See, it's not just the policy impact; it's also the political impact. It makes the Republicans take ownership of Obamacare, and it forever taints their brand. And so the impact, quite apart from the real life impact on real life human beings, is that it entrenches it even further, because then it has the imprimatur of both parties, and that can't be good, and that can't help in future efforts to reform the thing. It just will make it more and more difficult. Like, for example, freezing it left in the ban on insurers refusing to cover pre-existing conditions, and that makes it out like it's normal. We're having like a generation of kids now grow up, like our interns here at Capitol Research Center, who have no experience prior to the Obama era. So they think the way things are right now, with big government running everything, they think that this is normal and this is the way things are supposed to be. So it has ramifications beyond how it affects people's pocketbooks and how they live their daily lives.
People have somehow gotten this idea that insurance is supposed to protect you compared to other people, when in fact insurance is supposed to protect you against your own risks. The example would be back in the early days of the insurance business. You would have, let's say you had 4 ships that were going to be crossing the Atlantic Ocean, which was very hazardous. And you might end up on average with maybe one of those 4 ships not making it back. You'd make a lot of money off those other 3, but that one ship would sink. And well, what if instead of one, it's you lost 2 ships or 3 ships? You'd be out of business. So what you would do is you would calculate the chance of losing, 1, 2, 3, or all 4 ships. You go to the insurance company, they do the calculation, and then you'd get together and you'd come up with an insurance contract where you would essentially give them part of your profits from your shipping business, and then in return they would insure you against a catastrophic loss, like if somehow all 4 of your ships disappeared mid-Atlantic. And so it evolved from that, and then insurance companies were actually very important in promoting safety. So, for example, if you had a factory and you didn't have the right fire alarms, you didn't have the smoke detectors or sprinklers, whatever it would be, the insurance company would say, well, we're not going to insure you unless you make sure that this is, up to snuff in terms of protecting your factory, because if it burns down, we have to reimburse you for it. So the insurance companies provided a service as sort of the enforcers of safety standards. And the same thing with liability insurance and people getting injured on the job. The insurance companies would force you to put in safety measures. But we somehow got the idea over time that the insurance business was supposed to transfer costs from one person to the next, so that if I have $100,000 a year in medical bills, well, gosh, it's only fair that this other person who has no medical bills or $200 a year in medical bills should have to pay more to benefit me. Well, there is a place, perhaps, for the government to do that. We don't want people starving, and we don't want people going completely without health care or without housing. So we do have some income transfer in our government. We can argue from a libertarian standpoint how far that should go, or whether that should exist at all. But we do have that. So there is an argument to be made for doing that at the government level, but you do it on a budget. You do it at the government level where it can be argued, it can be debated, people can vote on it, they can vote the politicians out if they don't like the policy. You don't do it through the insurance companies, because there's no way you can ever trace the benefits, the rewards, the costs.
Well, that leads to another question, which is the next time healthcare legislation comes up, because I dare say it's certain to come up before 2018, 2012, and the election, Steve, that you were just mentioning. The current reports in the news are that the White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, is going to try to get moderate Democrats on board for the next time that they bring up healthcare, and pretty much ignore the Freedom Caucus, which was a problem this time. Doesn't that mean that this is actually a setback for the Freedom Caucus?
Well, it ain't going to happen. The Democrats have taken a hard line. They will not cooperate in any way with this president. I don't know who these moderate Democrats are. Most of them are gone.
There are no moderate.
Yeah, it's
Democrats.
very, very few.
As Reince Pre-Wash is going to find.
Yeah, and so and they'll be primaried. It's not even a question of what in their hearts. Well, gosh, they'll do it for the good of the country. They can't, because their party is so hardcore. Remember, these are the people that think Donald Trump is a Russian spy because he was caught on blackmail tapes at the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow. And these are serious investigations.
Oh, and with the ladies peeing on the bed.
Exactly. And they believe this.
Yep.
So, okay. So they're this is Trump derangement syndrome, as some people call it. They will not work with Donald Trump. You will not have maybe one. I mean, people thought Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, Democrat, people thought, well, maybe he'll come over. No, they're not going to have, if they have one or two in the entire Congress, I'd be surprised. So that ain't going to happen. So you've got to get back with the Freedom Caucus. And it's fine for him to bash him a little bit, because remember, he's got to run for re-election, and they'll accuse him of being some right-winger, and this gives the president the opportunity to say, yeah, but look, I criticize the right-wingers, I'm a moderate kind of guy, I work with everybody. But as a practical political matter, it ain't gonna happen, because the Democrats know if they can just stop anything from happening, then the process will proceed. People who were going to become doctors won't be doctors. Drugs that would have been developed won't be developed. Clinics that would have opened, hospitals. I remember one part of Obamacare, believe it or not, was to shut down the physician-owned hospitals. They were, I think at one point, this is years ago, I'm working from memory, but I think it was like 26 physician-owned hospitals. Construction was immediately canceled at one point. And so it's to keep out competition. And those things, you can't turn that around immediately. In fact, it will take years to recover from this. So they know if they do nothing, it'll just mosey on, and eventually it'll be part of the fabric of life, and we'll be used to it, and we'll be stuck with it. Like the Brits, who brag about their horrible healthcare system, but they don't have anything to compare it to. And they just know the nice people that work for the health service, and they think they're doing a great job. They don't realize that their life expectancy is affected, and so on, because they don't know the alternative.
Well, Matthew, speaking of practical politics and other legislation, the one thing that the Ryan bill would have done is shaved $1 trillion off of the way Congress does its accounting for the next 10 years. So in other words, it would have put $1 trillion over 10 years in savings on the table. And what the Republicans wanted to do after passing that bill was turn around and say, okay, now we've freed up money to make it easier for us to pass a wide-ranging tax reform. That just got $1 trillion harder to do. So what about that ramification of pulling the Ryan-Trump bill?
Well, all of these projections tend to be lies in Washington. They're just made-up numbers, so we don't know if it's true. You've still got, I don't think that was a change to baseline accounting. I've written about it before, that Congress uses, which is basically crackhead accounting. It assumes that if a certain percentage of increase isn't obtained every year, that the budget is actually being cut. So I find the $1 trillion in so-called savings to be very difficult to believe in the first place. And as you suggested, or as you may have hinted at, they're going to spend the money anyway. So, whenever they talk about cost savings in government, it's very, you have to take it with a large grain of salt. I just don't believe these estimates. So
the fact is we're stuck at around 2% growth. What that means is that by the time my kids are my age, on average, the economy will be about 40% smaller than it would otherwise be. So the main problem that we face in this country is that the economy is just in the doldrums. It's moribund. We should have 4% growth. What does that mean? That means that you'll have 1.5 times, 1 2/3 as much wealth for the average person by the time my kids are my age. That's all the difference in the world. That's the difference whether you're going to have Social Security still in business, whether you're going to have Medicare and things like that still, all these entitlements they talk about. These things all what matters is the economic growth. And when you have something like Obamacare, which prevents businesses from expanding so they don't get hit with more mandates, which costs money for businesses so they don't have money to hire people. Those are the kind of things that you need to be worried about. And Matthew's right. The CBO, everybody, we got to have what the CBO figures out. They're going to score this thing. Well, they overestimated the number of people who would sign up for the exchanges by 120% or something like that by 2015. It was 10.3 and it actually was 24, whatever the math is.
It was unicorns and fairy dust.
Yeah, they just make this stuff up. And also you have to understand, the way people think in Washington is all the money is rightfully theirs to spend. And if you make the money, then you can have it provisionally, but we want to take it from you because we are the rightful owners, we're the rightful controllers of this. And that every time they say something like I heard yesterday on the George Stephanopoulos Sunday morning show, where he said, "Well, how are we gonna pay for these tax cuts?" And I immediately said, "Wait a minute, you pay for tax increases. You don't pay for tax cuts." Oh, wait, you're seeing it from the perspective of the Washington politicians, not from the perspective of the person out there in the country. And that's how they think.
Yeah, that's a tax expenditure. Please, Steve, use the right term.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a scam. I was there when they came up with this. I was covering a National League of Cities convention back, 25 years ago or so. And Teddy Kennedy's people were there promoting that this is how you should change your rhetoric so that anything that people are allowed to keep is a tax expenditure. And then that way, and you see that, by the way.
Right, which assumes that the government owns all the money.
Right, and they're allowed to, think about how they use this little trick. For example, they have refundable tax credits, such as the earned income tax credit. And then they increase that. Now, that's a welfare program because you're giving it to people who didn't pay taxes in the first place. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad to help, give people that. I mean, we can have a debate about that.
Some libertarians, like at the Cato Institute, say, as welfare programs go, it's one of the better ones.
Right. I'm not saying it's necessarily one of the best. I'm just saying it's welfare. And yet the politicians get to count it as a tax cut. So when Barack Obama would run around talking about all the people he'd cut taxes on and all the tax cuts he'd handed out, he would include this, but it's a welfare increase. So once they can switch rhetorically, so that the apples turn into oranges, then you've lost the debate, because anytime you want to reduce welfare spending, now you're increasing people's taxes automatically. It's insane.
Well, do either of you want to close out our discussion here with your own proposal of what should be done to repeal and replace?
Well, I'll say this. How about a system where you can have any insurance plan you want, or not have insurance? Because the Constitution says, and I know what John Roberts said, but the Constitution actually says that they can't make you buy anything you don't want. And you buy a health care plan. It can be any health care plan you want. It can cover A, B, and C, or it can cover C, D, and E, or any combination of things. And you get to go out there and buy it. And the government can't tell you what you can do or not do. And then for that small number of people who have a problem like pre-existing condition, who aren't otherwise covered because they're already under Medicaid, they're poor, or they're already under Medicare, they're older, that small number of people, we have a separate program for those people, so they're taken care of. And then otherwise, you let people buy the health insurance that they want and get the benefits that they want.
Well, to quote one of my favorite lines from "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" and it's said by Tim Blake Nelson, "I'm with you, fellers."
Well, that's our show for this week. We'll be back next week, and we hope you will please join us. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. And you can also follow us on social media. At Facebook, we are Capital Research Center, and our handle at Twitter is @CapitalResearch. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum.
And I'm Scott Walter. Thanks for listening.